broadcasting from the Unshackled studios in Melbourne. This is WilmsFront, brought to you by the Unshackled.net. Now here's Tim Wilms.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special Monday night edition of WilmsFront in place of Tim's News Explosion. It is the 4th of April, 2022. We are live on the WilmsFront YouTube, DLive, and Odyssey channels, as well as on the Interactive Entropy software, where you can ask myself and my guest tonight questions and send through super chats. It is currently 8:30 p.m. here in Melbourne, Victoria. The federal election is due to be called any day now by Prime Minister Scott Morrison following the budget Josh Frydenberg delivered last week. All we know in this period of political limbo is that the election will be in a Saturday in May. We just don't know which Saturday yet. Scott Morrison, he will enter this campaign having failed to fulfill one of his key election commitments from his 2019 miracle win, and that is to pass a federal Religious Discrimination Act. The bill has been indefinitely shelved. This was after 5 Liberal moderate MPs crossed the floor to vote against it in the House of Representatives in the February sitting period this year. The religious discrimination bill that was presented to the Parliament, though, had been so watered down so significantly during the consultation phase that actually had no extra real protection for religious freedom. The promise by the Morrison government to Australians of faith to pass a Religious Discrimination Act was born out of the Ruddock Review into religious freedoms after same-sex marriage was passed following the marriage law postal survey, as Christians and other Australians of faith were concerned about the further erosion of their right to live their faith in their everyday life in accordance with their own conscience. Everyday Christians continue to be hauled before human rights and equal opportunity commissions because of vilification and discrimination complaints against them by those who say their religious beliefs have offended or hurt them. These Christians, they can even have their livelihoods and professional occupational licenses threatened when they're called before review boards. So this is why the Australian Human Rights Law Alliance was established in 2019 as a firm with its mission to help Christians with legal advocacy and legal advice in these sorts of situations. Its principal lawyer is John Steenhof, who is my guest tonight. John, welcome to WilmsFront.
Thanks, Tim. A pleasure to be here with you tonight. That was a very good and comprehensive introduction for tonight's topic. Well done.
I'm glad I was able to. It's always a challenge to summarize a long-running critical issue just in the intro of the show and not have you waiting in the virtual green room for too long.
Yeah, well, it's good to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking across a whole bunch of topics tonight with you. What would you like to start with?
Well, I'll first start with that mention that the Australian Human Rights Law Alliance is affiliated with the Australian Christian Lobby. The current director of the Australian Christian Lobby, Martin Isles, used to have your job before he moved over to the Australian Christian Lobby. And as the name Christian Lobby suggests, its role is to lobby for law and law changes that will help better protect Christians in their everyday life. While over at the Australian Human Rights Law Alliance, it's your primary role is to help Christians navigate the various federal, state, and territory legal frameworks, which are becoming increasingly difficult for Christians to navigate, and they can fall. As a lot of your cases show, it just takes one complaint under any of these laws, and they find themselves in a really stressful situation.
Yeah, that's correct. So yes, you're right. We are associated with and a sister organisation of the Australian Christian Lobby. I like to use the analogy of the Hemsworth brothers. I think everyone are familiar with. Three brothers are Hemsworth brothers. One of them very famous, one of them slightly famous, and one of them unknown. So ACL is definitely the Chris Hemsworth of the family of companies that makes up Australian Christian Lobby. And we are the younger brother. So they are the giant there. They've spent great work over the years done by Jim Wallace when he was general manager, and then Lyle Shelton. And then most recently, Martin's taken it to new levels with his advocacy for Christianity. So we share a lot of DNA with the Australian Christian Lobby, but we are now a separate organisation. And the genesis of Human Rights Law Alliance was that originally it started inside ACL as a sort of clearinghouse for the increasing amount of people who are calling and asking, what do I do? I'm getting in trouble at work. I've had some hostility from university. I've gone through a disciplinary complaint. I've got someone who's chasing after me for a vilification claim, saying that I've said bad things about the LGBTQ community, et cetera, And it started out, and this was Martin's role, to then give those cases to lawyers who were sympathetic, who were willing to help in different states and territories. But as that workload increased, it was soon realized that a specific purpose-built law firm would be a good initiative to start. And so Human Rights Law Alliance was born as a separate law firm. I came on board as the principal lawyer at the beginning of 2019. And so we've been running cases in our own right since then. And there's plenty of work out there, Tim.
And your website, which is for viewers and listeners, is hrla.org.au. It has a comprehensive list of the individual cases you've been involved in. Some of the names have been changed to obviously protect legal processes and some people from further vilification. But
yep.
It's it's pretty clear that the main two issues that cultural issues that Christians get into trouble, when I say trouble, fall afoul of these tribunals, and when there's complaints made, is basically when they express their honestly held beliefs on LGBT and life issues.
Yeah, that's right. Those seem to be the particularly contentious issues of the day. They are the issues which have seen a lot of political scrutiny over time, and where you've got some very active lobbying and activist voices in the community, and where we've seen the most massive overhaul and transition of public views and public morality is in this space around LGBTQ issues. And so as the prevailing fashionable ideologies of the day have changed rapidly over the last 40, 50 years, and people of faith generally tie themselves to a set of beliefs and virtues and principles that are largely unchanged, it's meant that there's been increasing conflict and hostility between them. We also have moved from, I think, a time where we talked about a confident pluralism in our society, where you had this idea that many people of many different beliefs could exist and coexist right alongside each other in relative harmony. And it was okay if you believed something completely different to what I believed. That was fine, as long as we didn't get in each other's way. And it's been described at various times as pluralism or multiculturalism, etc. But now we seem to be moving into a time where society is becoming more aggressively secular. And there is this hostile progressivism, which is saying that not only must you tolerate certain views, tolerate certain ideologies, but you're increasingly called on to enthusiastically affirm and support those views. And that often, again, is tied up with LGBTQ issues, which are the issue du jour. And this is what's often leading not just Christian people, but many people to be facing hostility in their workplaces, at universities, in social media, etc., when they don't want to bow the knee to whatever is the fashionable idea of the day, or where they criticize something which is being held up as a sacred cow, like a Black Lives Matter or climate change or progressive politics. So that movement in society, I think, is starting to really sharpen and become more of a what they call a culture war. Although I've never liked that term, because the people I'm working with mostly are involved in cultural defense, where the attack is coming from one side and they're just trying to raise their shields and parry it away. They haven't been the aggressor in most of those situations.
The pluralistic society that we used to have, as you alluded to, it's not just about Christians and other religions and people of no faith living together, but living together in harmony. But we're seeing it all throughout society. You mentioned that, well, Black Lives Matter has nothing to do with religion or anything like that, but there's becoming now, and it's filtering through, why the workplaces are becoming such a minefield, is because all of the corporations, they adopt the fashionable, what is the winning zeitgeist, which is the only one that's allowed. And Black Lives Matter is one thing, but also I'm getting just mentioning other cultural issues, recognise voice to Parliament on Indigenous issues. That's another one where even people who are not Christians but just have conservative or libertarian or nationalist views, they're very marginalised. Not just and this is not just at work during work hours, and this is how Israel Folau found his Rugby Australia contract terminated. It was something he said on his private Instagram outside of work, but he had his contract terminated.
Yeah, absolutely. So Israel Folau is a classic example of where this progressive creeping of these issues hit a flashpoint with someone who was very public, very famous, and had a profile. And that was in the case of Israel Folau in 2019, which was one of the key sort of milestones and waypoints that we saw as part of the last election, which really brought religious freedom for a brief moment into the public arena, shed some light on it. People were talking about it, and became one of the issues that was definitive in the 2019 election. There was a perception that Scott Morrison was a person of faith who was also more of an everyday bloke who understood the concerns of everyday Australians, in contrast to a Labor Party which was so assured that it was going to have victory that it was able to wear its progressive talking points very proudly on its sleeve and prominently in its messaging, and was seen to have lost the support of many of the working class Australian people of faith that they had just assumed would support them as the party of the working people. And they saw the huge swings in the Western Sydney seats against sitting Labor members in what should be very safe seats. I think Chris Bowen's seat, someone told me, had a swing of 8% against him, which was unheard of. And much of that was put down to the loss of support of the many different religious groups in his area who thought that the Labor Party had sold them out and given themselves over to progressive ideology, particularly LGBTQ ideology.
Well, 3 years later, the Liberal government, the Morrison government, accused of doing exactly the same. And as I said in my introduction, they have failed to deliver, you can say, broken a promise. And we've seen what has happened to governments in the past that have broken election commitment, key promises. And I have no doubt in my mind that Scott Morrison is a man of deep faith. But in terms of that driving him as Prime Minister to do something, persevere with a religious discrimination act, he obviously fell short in that. He didn't really want to defend Israel Folau when his contract got terminated. What was the line that he used? I think that issue has had enough oxygen. And we'll go into how, well, I'll allow you first to explain how the religious discrimination bill, how it became so watered down, and then we'll delve into how it eventually fell over in the Parliament.
Sure. Tim, that's a massive subject, and it's got so many moving parts to it. I mean, just in your introduction, you talked about the fact that this has had such a long genesis. As compared to a lot of progressive legislation, particularly in Victoria, which can be introduced and passed in less than 2 months, this has had a 5-year history, and even longer for some of the advocates for religious liberty who've been wanting religious belief and activity to have the same protections as other attributes have for a long time. But really, we sort of look at the first real issue where this arose was at the time of the same-sex marriage postal vote, the plebiscite, where it was recognized that to just simply change the marriage law would then put in jeopardy many of the institutions which still held to a traditional conception of marriage, to those who were not able to endorse same-sex marriage or the genderless marriage that we got from that legislation. And when key voices for religious liberty tried to amend the marriage law changes to include protections and a few balancing clauses to make sure that we didn't completely swing the pendulum the other way, those were all rejected. And it was said, let's not clog this up. The nation has spoken. Let's get this done. And we'll have a review afterwards, which was the Ruddock Review that put out a report in 2017, I believe, or 2018, which was kept secret and not released, but leaked by the media piece by piece in late 2018. Then you had Penny Wong's attempt to strip away protections for Christian schools in 2018, which was very important because exactly the same thing came up as the religious discrimination bill was going through Parliament. But that became a key election issue, religious discrimination, at the election in May 2019. It was heightened by issues like Israel Folau and the policies of the Labor Party, the ALP, which seemed to have lost touch. And arising from the campaign was Scott Morrison's promise that he would implement what the Ruddock Review had suggested and recommended, which was give religious freedom the same protection as other attributes have had, some for 40 years at a federal level. So sex discrimination has been illegal since 1977. Religious discrimination is still allowed. Now, some states protect it, but New South Wales, for instance, doesn't. You could quite easily put up a sign in your bakery in New South Wales saying, we will not serve Jews or Muslims or Christians, and it would be completely legal. There certainly wouldn't be the ability of a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim to take a discrimination claim in the same way you could do for any other attribute. And there is a compelling reason to have a religious discrimination bill when you look at it in its proper terms as compared to other attributes. And when you look at the real cases of discrimination that religious people are increasingly facing, and not just Christians, but others. And yet, the bill was constantly hijacked by an aggressive, anti-religious, secularist voice within the media, within activist groups, within policy and lobby groups that are supposed to be facially neutral, but really quite antagonistic on these issues. And at the end, even as the bill had been watered down and took quite a neutral position and was far less than advocates thought of it, at the end, it was completely and utterly hijacked. I don't know if you remember this, but there was this outrage that the bill might allow Christian schools to expel gay children or reinforce rights that I said to already exist in the Sex Discrimination Act for Christian schools to adversely treat gay kids, as the activists call them, or trans kids. Not terms that, of course, we would use as religious people, but it was a fear-mongering tactic where a bill about religious discrimination was completely hijacked by LGBTQ activists. And there were plenty of people, most notably the moderate Liberal MPs, who were quite willing to just be sycophantic mouthpieces for those activist views, which were completely unfounded, were just scare tactics, and were merely trying to reintroduce what Penny Wong failed to do in 2018, which is strip away the protections for Christian schools which keep activists out. And faced with a mediocre bill, and then a bill that had been hijacked and threatened protections in law for Christian schools, and thereby by extension for the Christian parents who want their children educated at Christian schools, I think most people said this is a disaster and it needs to be terminated. And so the bill needed to be withdrawn, and was. So that's sort of one aspect of what happened in the religious discrimination bill.
And just before it was introduced in that sitting week in February, there was the City Point Christian College enrollment contract that burst into the media. It aired on the Sunday Project, and so it set the agenda for the week. And obviously, the intention was to be upfront with prospective parents and students. We're a Christian school. This is what we believe, but it was twisted, and this goes into how Christians who have a traditional view of sex and sexuality, the secular and the far leftist militant LGBT lobby have been very successful in painting Christians as people who want to really marginalize and outcast those people in society who are same-sex attracted or have gender dysphoria. And so they sold this enrollment contract is that if you are LGBT, we think you're really low in society. That's the narrative that they've sold, and that is, I think, what fed into the decision of those 5 Liberals to cross the floor.
You would think so, if you were looking at it, just watching the media as it went past you from day to day, but it's not actually the case. These moderates had already been active on this months in advance. And in fact, the concerted attack on the protections for Christian schools had already been promised in correspondence from Scott Morrison in the beginning of December in a letter that he wrote to Anthony Albanese to try to get support to get the religious discrimination bill across the line. So the City Point the City Point saga unfolded just at a time that was coincidental.
Yeah, well, I was sort of saying it was good timing to really make sure that they could, well, kill this bill.
That's what certainly wasn't good press for a religious discrimination bill. It had nothing to do with the content of the religious discrimination bill, but it allowed the opponents of the bill to reinforce their reason for hijacking the bill and making it about LGBTQ issues when in fact it had nothing to do with them whatsoever. And the City Point saga itself is an interesting lesson, because what happened was that a school put out a contract thinking that its problems in dealing with issues of gender and issues of sexuality were going to confront them in a legal fashion, so they needed to have a legal preparation for it, hence a contract. What they didn't realize is that any sort of legal challenge was not going to come straight away. The first thing you face when you face hostility for your faith is never the legal challenge. It's the social pressure. It's being tried in the court of public opinion, and that public opinion is shaped and fashioned by the activists in lockstep with the media. So it's interesting that this school, City Point, and again, I've not talked to City Point. I didn't work for City Point. I just read the media and I've given a few talks on it. They circulated to all of their parents a enrollment contract for students on a Friday afternoon. By Saturday morning, a Brisbane homosexual activist, or a very sort of prominent homosexual media presence, internet presence, has got a copy of the contract, has put the whole thing on Twitter, and has snipped out all of the bits that they can find that talk only about sexuality and gender. So there's about 5 parts of the contract and 16 pages that talk about gender and sexuality. The rest of the contract talks about the incredible richness of the education that you'll receive at a Christian school, the way that the school recognizes the dignity and worth of every human being, the way that the school will seek to meet children at their needs and minister to them wherever they are, however they are, and instill in them virtues of goodness, of love, of gentleness, etc., etc. Now, do you think that any of those particular thoughts and sentiments, clauses, principles that were all through this contract were brought to the attention of anyone in the public? None of those things. It was the 5 little bits that they could find that dealt with gender and sexuality, and it made it sound like the whole 16-page contract was fairly and squarely aimed at targeting vulnerable children, when it's completely and utterly the opposite of that. And I think experience with Christian schools shows that they are the safest place for vulnerable children to be. They are a place which shields them from a hypersexual culture, which shields them from the work of activists who have been getting into our public school systems and pretty much run the wellness teams, the sexual education teams. And parents don't like this. That's why a lot of Christian schools are completely full, why their roles are growing by 20% every year, because parents simply don't want their kids indoctrinated into transgender ideology. And the activists hate this. And so what they do is they weaponize the kids to try to water down and dilute the stance that schools are taking, which are protecting kids and protecting parents and keeping the activists out. And that's what City Point was about. And that's why the religious discrimination bill was hijacked by a movement that wants to focus on this issue every time.
It's worth making the point, though, that many Christian schools of various denominations have fully embraced all of the ideology of the public schools. So there's a lot of faith-based schools, but a lot of them, to use another issue, a lot of them advance the climate agenda. So it's certainly parents, they need to work out if they want their children to receive a more traditional education, work out not just send them to any Christian school, but find the best one.
Oh, that's right. There's certainly many schools that go under the moniker Christian, which for a long time have had little or no formation in Christian doctrines, Christian beliefs, Christian virtues, but have largely taken a very secular ideology and sprinkled it with a little bit of Christian sprinkles. But thankfully, not all Christian schools are like that. In fact, there are many, many good schools out there still trying to be faithful to the basis and tenets of Christianity and express that in their teaching for the benefit of everybody, not just for their Christian students, but for the students who come in from the outside, who benefit from having a Christian education, who are never forced or compelled into a religion or coerced against their will, but really benefit from being in a system which practices those virtues. And now those virtues are under attack.
Going back to what I was saying about how the media and the activists spanned the City Point contract, that it was designed to say that gay and trans people were not welcome, and that's the successful narrative that they've tried to paint the Christian lobby, and they broadened it in the Equality Australia put out an ad against the proposed religious discrimination bill, where they had a whole bunch of LGBT people talk about, if this law passes, then LGBT people will be discriminated not just in schools, but in healthcare, aged care, disability care, social care, and they are always able to wheel out Ian Thorpe. He even went to Canberra
Yes.
on one occasion, because obviously he is somebody who struggled with his sexuality for many years because of society, and only recently had the courage to come out. And so he's able to be the main face that what Christians believe and and other traditional views on sexuality can hurt LGBT people, and so this is why these laws are a bad idea. And some of the other this is also there can also be complaints against Christian doctors and other medical professionals, because they hold traditional Christian views as well. It's this whole thing that your views can really damage people. This is the argument.
Yeah, it's increasingly how the argument has migrated over the years. It used to be that sticks and stones could break your bones, but names could never hurt you. And now that's turned into a narrative that names often hurt you and cause much more damage than the minor damage and temporary damage of getting hit with a stick or a stone, but have complex mental health implications that will last for years and can often cause all sorts of horrible outcomes, such as suicide, etc. And it has been a successful narrative, but if you peel back the layers of that narrative, it really does not hold water, and there's not a lot of a real basis for trying to advance that narrative other than for pure and naked political purposes. The campaign that was waged by Equality Australia against the religious discrimination bill was disingenuous, was scaremongering, and arguably is going to cause more mental health problems for LGBT Australians than the religious discrimination bill, because of the vile mistruths that were propagated by that campaign about what was going to be allowed and legal if the religious discrimination bill passed. And none of it held water if it was subjected to a microscope. If you ask them the question, well, how is this bill going to turn out to allow the hypothetical that you've talked about. So one of the ones I think they said was that if this bill passes, the carer at your childcare facility can come up and take your child out of the car and then tell you that you're going to hell because you're a lesbian mum. And that would be okay. So there were all these warnings about various kinds of speeches that could be made, and not just to LGBTQ people, but that, say, a Christian could come up to someone with a disability and say,
Yes.
your disability is caused by your sin, or because you don't love God, because you don't have enough faith, and insult a disabled person that way. And that is complete and utter nonsense. It's absolutely fanciful. There was nothing in the bill that allowed that at all. It completely ignored the fact that most of those behaviours have legal remedies against them now, which will remain unchanged. Duties that you have to your employer, duties that you have to the customer that are imposed by your employer, which are reasonable directions in your employment, which would stop a health care worker, which would stop a child carer, which would stop a disability provider from saying those things. It's either that they're illegal now and there are laws in place that have been enforced many, many times to stop people from saying rude things to customers or to people.
Even if it was legal, Christians, the overwhelming majority wouldn't say that.
Well, the interesting thing is that who do you think historically has been most concerned for the disabled in Western cultures, in the cultures that we live in? It's Christians. Christians were the first ones to start up orphanages. Christians were the first ones to start up homes for the blind. Christians were known in the first century in Rome to be the ones who didn't commit infanticide, who didn't get rid of the young girls, who had a concern for the weak and the disabled. And now you've got this fanciful hypothetical being raised that Christians are going to go around telling people that their disability is caused by sin. Well, Christians are responsible for most of the disabled care still in Australia. And yet there hasn't been that narrative at all, that counter narrative that's been able to make its way into the public perception. So if you talk to your everyday average Australian, they're quite happy that the religious discrimination bill didn't pass, or at least they're indifferent. I mean, they don't see the compelling need for it, and they know that there was some controversy and they don't like controversy, so it's good that it didn't pass.
With the passing of the same-sex marriage, because it was a public vote of sorts, it wasn't a plebiscite per se, but a postal survey, and it was 80% of Australians who responded, 61% yes, 39% no. And since, because of that strong, you'd call it two-party preferred vote if you're going to use it in political terms.
Yeah,
it's because it was such a strong mandate. That's also why the religious discrimination bill was able to be, or basically turned on its head to say no, it needs to be about actually protecting more, protecting LGBT people further, because this is what the public voted for in 2017, and certainly there'd be politicians who'd be aware of this, and it's like, well, I don't want to go too out on a limb for people who are the minority now, because I still want to get well, the Liberals still want to win all their inner city seats, and they also want to keep Twitter and the mainstream media happy. So certainly not the legalization of same-sex marriage itself, but the public vote has really, I think, turned the tide against protecting faith, because we live in a hyper-partisan era where it's like, you lose, you suffer.
Yeah, I think we also live in an era where we are lacking in conviction politicians. We have politicians who are primarily motivated by ensuring that they keep their majorities, they keep their seats in Parliament, and that they make short-term decisions that will yield short-term political results. And I think that was the fate of the religious discrimination bill. There's been a lot of criticism of Scott Morrison, and there are aspects to criticise for sure of the way that the carriage of the bill was progressed. It would have been good to see it have more urgency on the agenda than it had. That it was interesting that the reason why the bill was delayed was supposedly because of COVID. Yet, if you look at some of the worst and most pernicious progressive legislation that's been passed in the last 2.5 years, it's been done right in the middle of COVID, and not just in Australia, but overseas as well. COVID certainly hasn't stopped really invasive progressive legislation, and shouldn't have stopped what was a rather benign and reasonable religious discrimination bill from being progressed quickly. But you had the issues with Christian Porter had carriage of it, and he was the one pushing forward the bill. And then he, of course, was subject to quite a lot of controversy, had to step down, and it was taken up again by the new Attorney General. What's her name? You remember the name of the new attorney? Michaelia Cash.
Michaelia Cash, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and she, I believe in the past, has addressed Australian Christian lobby conferences. Like, she is from the conservative right.
Yeah, but I think by the time she got the bill, there was, firstly, you've got a lot of water under the bridge, and you've had a process that's been leading to the progressive watering down of the bill over time, and it's not going to get stronger. It's only going to get weaker. Secondly, she's dealing with the political realities that are in front of her, which are a Liberal Party which has been incredibly disciplined on government policy up till now, but on this issue, it's going to really be a dividing line for many of the moderates who are in those inner city seats, for whom religious discrimination bill is going to be electoral poison for them, or so they think. I mean, these are all people who now have independents going up against them from the Voices of campaign.
In
oh yeah, totally independent. So, and they are all, of course, strong conservatives, and Menzies in the small L liberal tradition is, I think, how they are often described. And I can't think of any candidates who are probably less Menzies and less small L liberal, but nonetheless, that we digress. What I was saying was that effectively Cash was dealing with that sort of political reality in her own party. You've got a Labor Party who has been chastened at the last election and wants to make themselves a small target on religious freedom. So it's going to make general noises of support for motherhood and apple pie statements without putting their stake in the ground, and as well likes to sit by and with the popcorn and watch the Liberal Party implode on this issue, which they did. And then you've got the government departments that are actually drafting and giving the legal advice. And all of those are staffed with people who either don't understand religion and religious Australians at all, or are actively hostile to them and will just pick up the talking points of parties like Equality Australia and just throw them back at the advocates for this bill, and suggest that what is being asked for, which has been granted in relation to other attributes, can't be done here. And so those are some of the factors that went into the demise of the religious discrimination bill. If it was going to pass, it needed to be done quickly, confidently, and with conviction. And none of those things were a hallmark of its passage. The only good things I can say were some of the strong support given by Conservatives within the Liberal National Government, a very, very good introductory speech by Scott Morrison when he introduced the bill, and the fact that he personally introduced the bill himself as a person of faith, even as the bill faced headwinds. I mean, those are not to be scoffed at. There were also some good things that did make their way into the bill. Nothing mind-blowing, but there were some good aspects to it. But in my view, as soon as it got hijacked by its opponents and was made to be about Christian schools and the treatment of vulnerable kids, then it really got depth charged at that stage and was not worth pursuing.
Meanwhile, you look at the other side here in Victoria. Despite Victoria being shut down most of 2020, 2021, Dan Andrews still had time to ram through the gay conversion therapy ban. Again, I'm using inverted commas. It was titled, well, the full title was the Change or Suppression Conversion Practices Prohibition Act. And again, the justification or the narrative that was put forward by this legislation was necessary. Well, this wasn't explicitly said, but it was alluded to that Christian pray away the gay camps back in the day subjected vulnerable children to cruelty, and there's some who've even advocated for electroshock therapy. So that's what it was sold as. We'll stop these extremist Christians from electroshock therapying vulnerable teenagers and driving them to suicide. That was the narrative the bill was sold as.
Yeah, and again, that narrative was completely unfounded. Particularly the idea that Christians anywhere were ever using any sort of electroshock therapy. And I've been in a lot of different churches in my job and had a lot of different contact with a lot of different groups. And none of them have ever had anything remotely like electroshock therapy equipment in their churches. So to say that Christians were doing that is completely laughable and isn't borne out with any research. There was a school of psychiatry that thought that aversion therapy by electric shock or by stimulating the brain with electric shocks was going to be effective for dealing with unwanted same-sex attraction. No one was ever subjected to that as a child, only adults. There was one clinic in Sydney which did it during the 1950s that I think that people are aware of, but it largely fell out of fashion and died a natural death. Interestingly, that kind of electroshock therapy is still used as a real and viable treatment for people who suffer mental distress and other psychological disorders. It's not meant to be a punishment or some sort of torture, but was meant to be a way of electronically stimulating the brain. And yet this narrative, this boogeyman story that's pervaded all of the discussion on conversion therapy to suggest that Christians were doing this, and it just wasn't happening. Indeed, there was a study called Preventing Harm, Promoting Justice, which was done by La Trobe, Gay and Lesbian Health, a lobby group, which went around and tried to find as many stories as they could about people who had experienced conversion therapy. And the best they could come up with from all around Australia was 15 stories of people who had gone to a camp and heard a speaker about who claimed to be ex-gay and where they were often encouraged not to be gay. None of them faced any sort of coercive therapies. At most, they would have people praying over them or engaging in a deliverance kind of ministry, again, which is non-invasive and non-coercive. Almost all of them were adults, and many of them voluntarily went or enthusiastically went. Some of them even reported favorably about aspects of it in this report. But there's 15 people. And this is it called itself the only research about this in Australia. And it was the basis for the passing of this law on a false premise, on a scare story. The other interesting thing is that they then went and said, well, are there any people who've actually benefited from talk therapy, who actually have experienced unwanted same-sex attraction, have gone to get counseling, and have had positive outcomes and positive benefits? There was a website called freetochange.org, which catalogued 89 stories of people who had had positive experiences. And those were completely ignored. Do you think any of those people could get an audience with a sitting Labor parliamentarian or with Dan Andrews or get in front of government to talk about the way that religious therapy, professional psychological help, etc., had actually made their lives better, had decreased all of their morbidities, had given them confidence to be able to live normal heterosexual lives that they'd always wanted, normal lives in terms of identity, because of course the transgender issue was smushed into and added into these conversion therapy bills, and indeed seems to be the real point of them, which is to prop up what is a nonsense transgender ideology and force everyone to abide by it. So those laws passed in a matter of weeks, months in Queensland. There was a little bit of pushback in Queensland in a committee, thankfully, but in ACT and Victoria, they just shot through. And that's a real interesting contrast to the religious discrimination bill, and tells you a little bit about the zeitgeist and the political climate that we're in, when progressive laws that are really anti-Christian can sail through without a problem, and a largely unremarkable religious discrimination bill gets stuck in the mud for 4 years and ultimately is unsuccessful.
Well, Victoria was the first state to decriminalize abortion. That spread all throughout Australia and New Zealand. Same with euthanasia, and now with these conversion therapy bans. So the history is once a huge cultural law is changed in Victoria, it tends to go all throughout Australia and New Zealand. But the reality, like the actual reality of this Victorian bill is that it can have, like, possibly have the effect of, well, it does have the effect of, like, criminalize private conversations, even if there's a gender confused child. If there's a discussion about that not affirming it,
absolutely,
they'll outgrow it, that can be considered illegal.
So parents who have raised and grown up with a child and know their child intimately and love them unconditionally, and maybe this child's 12 years old, and a family counsellor with a degree off the back of a cereal box at a school says your child is gender dysphoric and needs to be put on puberty blockers. If the parents were to oppose that and tell the child, wait, don't take these steps, which are going to cause irreversible damage to your body, which we think are just a passing phase, which oftentimes they are. If they say, wait, this law criminalizes parents. It criminalizes parents who have the best interests of their child at heart, and allows state organs, professionals who oftentimes are trying to pursue a progressive agenda on these things, to be able to coerce parents and force them into this, which they're doing already without conversion therapy laws. But now there's this sanction of criminality hanging over the heads of parents. And it's just an absolutely shocking law.
And over the course of the pandemic, over the past 2 years, with the various lockdowns and restrictions, the governments have forced the churches and other houses of worship to close, and for some periods towards the end of last year, I actually made them enforce vaccine passes and also enforce mask mandates as well. There was that it's still incomprehensible that WA police officer who went into a Catholic church to check mask exemptions. That never happened in Victoria. If they wanted to, obviously here in Victoria, there was that crackdown on Orthodox Jews during the
Yom Kippur, I think it was.
Yes,
was it?
Yes, but the Victoria Police never dared go into the synagogue, because obviously that brings up what happened in Germany in the 1930s, which is why I was taken aback that the the state, it's come to that you have a police officer in there regulating how the congregation is happening in real time.
Yeah, absolutely. The rules that and the mandates that were put in place, and the requirements for vaccine passports that were put in place for places of worship, but also wider throughout the various public aspects of our lives that were so draconianly restricted. I mean, they're just wicked laws, and they should never have been passed. But the Australian populace seems to be largely happy with the way that those things were put in place, and had very little concerns or premiums placed on freedoms in general if there was any sort of threat to safety. I think what it's shown us is that people, if they're given a crisis, will always choose safety over freedom. They'll much rather have the government tell them what they can do and when, than be given information, have to weigh it themselves and make their own decisions. I mean, this is such a massive topic, I don't want to get into it, but certainly we've seen a disproportionate overreach into religious exercise during the COVID pandemic. And the ironic thing is that a lot of the impositions on religious freedom have been done in the name of, well, look, keep what you're doing in your own head, keep what you're doing inside your own church, do it in your own church. And now, even with these kinds of restrictions, those rules are reaching into the church and compelling behaviors, compelling the sort of passport checking requirements that is completely antithetical to the fundamental beliefs of Christians and other religions. And there's some good challenges that have been done to those worldwide. But in Australia, we have fragile protection for all freedoms, including religious freedom, and we just simply haven't had a real case, a viable case that we could take to challenge those mandates. I mean, even New Zealand's in a better position than us. They've got one case being taken on behalf of, I think, 120, 130 churches, about 10 mosques, and a couple of pastors, which have banded together to challenge the traffic light system and the passport system that they've got in New Zealand for churches. And it has a good chance of being successful. Cases here, not really got much of a chance.
So the Human Rights Law Alliance is very realistic about what avenues are available to challenge not just the COVID laws mandates regarding houses of worship, but also in the cases that you take on, because Australia has no Bill of Rights or anything like that. Our constitution's basically the separation of powers division between state and federal. So you're very I notice on your FAQs on your website, you're very blunt about, if this happens if you say this in your workplace, this is likely to happen. And
yep, yeah, I mean, we're trying to provide a system of precedent by running the best cases, using the best lawyers and the best experts to get the best results. And really what we're trying to do is sandbag religious freedom against the flood of opposition that's coming against it. But not just because that's going to make a better society by itself. I mean, we are Christians. That's why we do the work we do. And we believe that we need to have space for people to be living out their Christian faith, because that's good for society. Sharing and observing their Christian faith, because that's good for society. Being confident and robust in their disagreement with others, and confident in the way that they express, and free to express and live out the ways that they are different from whatever is the prevailing and fashionable narrative of the day, because that is good for a tolerant and civil society. And so that requires Christians to do that and live that way. And if we can run all the cases we want, but if Christians aren't actively out there and living it, then it's not going to change anything, and it's not going to help Australian society. That's what we think.
And it is like, I think it is sad that a lot of the cases that you've taken on, it's just Christians being persecuted because they're being honest. Like, I want Christians to be honest in their beliefs. I want, like, as you were talking about, the pluralistic society, we have lost that frank and fearless exchange of ideas. I mean,
Yep.
I'm an atheist. I've interviewed you for an hour. My producer, Margot, who helped arrange this interview, she's a Christian. Me and her, we work fantastically putting on this show and other Unshackled productions. We don't agree on everything politically either, but we have overarching values about free speech, a free society.
Yep. And you'll find that within Christianity as well. There are plenty of people I have absolute disagreements with about on things that I think are very important, where I think they're very wrong, but it doesn't mean I'd strike them off my Christmas card list or go nuts against them on Twitter or Instagram or cancel them as my friend on Facebook. And sadly, that's sort of happening in a wider culture, not just for people of religion, but they've largely been the canaries in the coal mine on these issues. They have really been the ones who've seen cancel culture before it was cancel culture, and now it's pervading the rest of society. And it isn't a good thing, because ideas aren't being met with ideas, they're being met with cancellation, lawfare, social media pressure, etc. That all of those things which shut down the probing of all ideas by other ideas to see which ideas are the best. So
now, as I mentioned at the start of the show, the federal election will be called any day now. I know you're the younger Hemsworth brother.
I don't do political lobbying.
Yeah, but the Australian Christian lobby, the Chris Hemsworth older brother, during the federal election has its various candidate forums, and it's what do you think that what Christians should be or looking out for, expecting? Will the Morrison recommit to trying the religious discrimination bill again? What's your thoughts about how Christians should see the next federal election?
Big question. I think the most important thing is to look at your local candidates. I think people are increasingly not just voting by a party, but looking at where people stand on particular issues. And I think it needs wisdom and judgment on trying to put into Parliament the best person who's going to represent you in the local electorate, but also look at what's going to be the best party or the best circumstances for the main issues that are important for you. So as Christians, I think you should look at who's going to do the best job for the whole of society, including the protection of religious freedom. I don't like to be someone who advocates people to only vote for people for what they're going to do for you, but vote for someone who's got a real sense of civic duty and is a conviction politician. It's been interesting. I often will talk to large groups of generally conservative and generally Christian people, and I'll often take a straw poll about where they would vote in an election, whether it would be Labor, Liberal, Greens, other. And usually there's a massive amount of Liberal voters in there, over 50%, sometimes up to 80%. As I've been leading up to this election, the amount of people who've been voting Liberal in my very unscientific straw polls of small numbers of people of almost exclusively conservative bent, those people say they're deserting the Liberal Party in droves, and they feel politically homeless because they're not flocking to Labor, but they usually stand up for some sort of hybrid of either the independents, I presume conservative independents, or donkey votes. Even some have been confident to say that. And that seems to be an interesting state of affairs, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out at the election.
Yes, the others in the opinion polls, it's sort of dismissed a lot of the time in the commentary. It's all about the two-party preferred, but on election day, where the others fall, particularly in the upper house, that could be something noteworthy.
It'll be interesting to see, because a lot of people say they'll vote for an independent, and it feels like they get to the ballot box and that never actually happens. But we live in interesting times, Tim, and I don't want to predict things. I don't want to be Peter Onselin. Remember, he said, if Labor doesn't win the 2019 election, you can basically disregard anything I say ever from then. So,
well, look at what's happened over since the last federal election. I mean, obviously the pandemic is the big thing, but now we've got the war in Russia, Ukraine. You're a fool if you think you can predict what's going to happen, even in a month or 2 months. But it's certainly having a wide view perspective and just taking a breath to analyze things is the most important. I've thoroughly enjoyed chatting with you tonight, John. I know tonight I've put a lot of sort of this is the narrative that's been put forward, and you've done a good job explaining why that's not true. Which is, it's been extremely informative discussion with you.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be with you, Tim, and thanks for having me on. And hopefully we get another chance to do the rest of the 95% of surveying the field of religious liberty and implications for Australia. But thank you.
And so the website again is hrla.org.au, and you're also on Facebook.
Correct. We have a minuscule Facebook presence that we hope to beef up one day. And yes, look at our website. It's got cases. We also run the australiawatch.com.au website, which is a catalogue of all religious freedom cases, not just ours, that we're hoping to augment so that we have a real good catalogue of where Christians are facing and other people of religion are facing hostility. And we are a not-for-profit. We exist on the basis of donations. So if I can put in a plug, if you feel like donating to our work, do so at the HRLA website. It keeps us going. It keeps us able to do our work rather than having to go around with the collection plate and trying to collect money. And the work we're doing is good. I mean, we help people. People are very pleased with the work we're able to do for them. And it's nice to have someone standing up against a lot of the organs of state, the progressive activists, etc., who seem to wield so much power. We definitely are a David against a Goliath at the moment, and it's good and it's rewarding work, and it has eternal benefit.
Oh, well, I'm sure you'll keep it up. Take care, John.
Thanks, Tim. Have a good night. Bye.
Bye. All right, everybody, that's the show for tonight. There's going to be another WilmsFront on Thursday. I've got Anthony Lev, one of the main spokespeople for the Melbourne Freedom Rally. Obviously, I'm going to ask him with the federal election might be called by that time. What are the plans, or what is the freedom movement on the lookout when it comes for election time? So that'll be at the usual time at 8:30 p.m. Melbourne time on the WilmsFront channels, and then I'll be back with Trad Tasman Talk Friday evening on the Unshackled YouTube channel with Dewey DeBoer. All right, everybody, take care. Have a safe and sane and happy week, and I'll see you on Thursday.
Thanks for tuning in to WilmsFront. Visit timwilms.com or Rational Rise TV to view the archive of episodes. And keep visiting the Unshackled.net to view all our shows and to keep up with the latest real news and analysis.